a culture hero or a role model or anything like that. You know, I don't want it to be the absolute last word in what the trendy style is.
What if the most iconic trio in country music history, three legendary voices who once sang in perfect harmony, were quietly torn apart, not by fame, scandal, or betrayal, but by something far more heartbreaking: silence? Behind the bright lights and standing ovations, a hidden fracture grew, unseen, unspoken, and unresolved. No one saw it coming, no public feud, no headlines, just a sudden stillness that would last for years. Why did Dolly Parton pull away from the project she once loved? Why did Linda Ronstadt never reach out? And what truth did Emmylou Harris witness but never reveal? This isn't just about music. It's about trust lost, words left unsaid, and a bond that crumbled in the quiet. You think you know their story, but the truth will leave you stunned. Because sometimes, the most powerful breakups don't happen in the spotlight. They happen when no one is watching. Think about this. She opened the door for Glenn Frey and company not because she lacked talent, but because she recognized substance beyond her own. She saw in Frey the spark of genius and the promise of teamwork, and in 1971, she chose them to back her, believing their musicianship would elevate her ballads and anthems alike. But as Hotel California soared to the top of the charts, the Eagles' shadows grew longer, and Linda's light seemed to dim in their story. Glenn Frey, once a respectful bandmate, distanced himself, his pride eclipsing gratitude. A 1977 interview saw him shrug off those early days, claiming, "We learned a lot, but frankly, we're on our own now." That single sentence rewrote a chapter of rock lore, turning allies into strangers overnight. Picture the stage illuminated for someone else, and realize how quickly admiration can curdle into indifference. Have you ever felt invisible in plain sight? The Hollywood Bowl reunion was meant to heal old wounds, a chance for Linda and the Eagles to share the spotlight one more time. Instead, it became her final lesson in being sidelined. Shortly before the set list was locked in, Frey's manager cold-called to suggest a reshuffle. The Eagles would close the show. Linda refused, not out of ego, but because she refused to let history be rewritten. In her mind, the story of their rise was a shared legacy, not a highlight reel to be edited. His response, a curt cancellation and the line, "I don't think the audience will be expecting you anymore," hit her harder than any critic's review. It wasn't competition she resented. It was the deliberate erasure of her role. Years later, when a journalist asked why she never joined Eagle celebrations, she laughed and said some prefer living with the story they've scripted. She didn't need vindication, but she also wouldn't pretend their story began without her. What happens when gratitude turns to resentment? In 1976, Linda found herself at odds with another hero, Neil Young. Both activists at heart, she expected solidarity at a benefit for immigrant workers. Instead, she felt sidelined from the moment she suggested Desperado and Blue Bayou, songs rich in emotion but light enough to connect. Neil dismissed her picks as salon music, insisting protest anthems must be blunt and uncompromising. To him, easy melodies diluted the message. To her, they were a bridge to empathy. On stage, she watched from the wings as the lineup ignored her presence, her heart sinking as she realized that even shared values couldn't guarantee respect. Behind the curtain, tears fell. Not for exclusion, but for being denied a voice in a cause she'd championed. That night, at 31, her vulnerability was laid bare, contrasting sharply with the confident icon she'd become. But the world doesn't stop spinning for emotional bruises. As her voice slowly began to leave her, Linda shifted focus, away from glittering stages and toward clarity. She made careful decisions about her voice, her image, and her finances. At a time when most celebrities were riding the chaotic wave of wealth, Linda stood back, observing. She wasn't the kind to flaunt Bentleys or line her wrists with gold, but make no mistake, she built a quiet empire. At the height of her fame, she owned multiple properties, including a sprawling home in Tucson, Arizona, a peaceful retreat far removed from the chaos of Los Angeles. That home became her sanctuary, a place where decisions weren't made with headlines in mind, but with her peace in focus. Her car collection reflected her personality, classic, low-key, yet timeless. She often drove a silver Mercedes SL, not because of the badge, but because it was reliable and elegant without demanding attention. While others jumped at fragrance lines or fashion collaborations, Linda took a different road. She invested in publishing rights, hers and others. She quietly acquired stakes in songwriter catalogs, a move that would eventually give her consistent revenue long after the spotlight dimmed. She understood one powerful truth: owning your voice matters, especially when the world is willing to pay to borrow it. Her business strategy was quiet genius. She stayed away from endorsements she didn't believe in and focused on licensing deals that protected her legacy. Insurance? She had it all. Career interruption policies, health coverage long before it was standard in the industry, and asset protection for her properties and music rights. It wasn't paranoia. It was foresight. She didn't wait for disaster to strike to secure what she built. That kind of planning came from watching others fall. She saw careers dissolve because of one wrong move, one scandal, one unpaid tax bill. Linda knew fame had a cost, but she was determined not to pay it twice. And in a world where extravagant spending became the norm, she quietly taught a lesson Hollywood often ignores. Build what lasts, not just what dazzles. Yet even with all the business savvy, Linda never forgot the heartbreaks. One of the deepest ones came not from a man in music, but from a woman who once called her the soul of American sound. Carly Simon. The bond they once shared was electric. Two powerful women in a man's world, united in spirit, voice, and drive. But the connection fractured during the production of a charity single that never quite made headlines. Carly, acting as the creative director, decided to cut Linda's solo verse for balance. The final edit left Linda's voice nearly absent. When she questioned it, Carly responded, "It's about the message, not individual ego." But for Linda, it was never about ego. It was about voice, visibility, and once again, being erased. She never confronted Carly publicly, but she withdrew, quietly, firmly. No collaborations followed, not even a casual stage appearance. When asked in an interview if she and Carly were still friends, Linda simply said, "I learned that sometimes silence isn't a punishment, it's self-respect." That line alone sent shockwaves through fans, many of whom had no idea about the behind-the-scenes tension. The press speculated, but Linda never clarified. She didn't have to. And that's what made her different. She didn't chase resolution for closure. She found it in her own reflection. These are not the kind of stories people expect to hear when they talk about Linda Ronstadt. Most remember her as the woman with the soaring voice, the romantic ballads, the shimmering performances. But few realize how much strength it took to navigate a world that smiled at her publicly while sidelining her privately. That smile, over time, became her armor. The Hollywood Linda walked into in the 1970s was not built for women like her. Intelligent, opinionated, unwilling to be anyone's accessory. And yet, she didn't break. She bent, she waited, she watched. And once gone, you stayed gone. But the deeper wounds? Those didn't come from the headliners. They came from the people you admired. The ones you thought would understand, because they too had once been underestimated. Linda never expected betrayal to wear such a familiar face. But then came the moment she wished she could forget. Her heartbreak disguised as admiration gone wrong. Joni Mitchell had always been a beacon to Linda, the woman who owned her words, shaped her melodies, and never asked permission to be profound. Linda didn't write her own songs. She lived inside others' lyrics and made them her own. And that was her artistry. But one night in '79, everything shifted. After a stirring rendition of River that brought the crowd to tears, Linda wandered backstage, heart open, hoping for a nod from her hero. Instead, Joni turned with a half-smile and quipped, "Didn't realize my songs were so commercial." It seemed offhand, almost harmless, but Linda heard every cold syllable tucked inside the smile. What came later hit even harder. In an interview, Joni's words etched themselves into Linda's memory. "I write from my blood. No one else can bleed for me." Linda folded the magazine, closed the chapter, and quietly declined every future suggestion to record another Mitchell song. Not out of bitterness, but out of something deeper: disappointment. It wasn't just artistic difference. It was a fracture. Because when someone you revere makes you feel like a counterfeit, the silence that follows isn't quiet. It echoes. And yet, Linda refused to fire back publicly. She carried her truth in her own way, with restraint, clarity, and quiet defiance. When asked years later if she'd work with Joni again, she didn't hesitate. "I admire talent, but I collaborate with kindness. One without the other is just noise." That one sentence said everything. Linda wasn't wounded because Joni was cruel. She was wounded because for a moment she believed they were walking the same road. And discovering that they weren't? That was the heartbreak. It was never about rivalry. It was about recognition. Linda was the voice of borrowed sorrow made personal. And if that wasn't enough for some, she no longer needed their permission to believe it was enough for her. But if Joni made her question herself, it was her bond with Dolly Parton and Emmylou Harris that brought her back to the music that didn't need explanation. Their partnership, 3 women, no masks, no ego, was a rarity in an industry that often pitted women against each other for survival. The trio albums weren't just musical collaborations. They were testaments to what could happen when women trusted each other enough to let go of center stage. The harmonies weren't just perfect. They were personal. Off stage, they laughed, cried, and held each other through the noise. Still, even in that sacred space, friction found its way in. Fame can't help but test the deepest bonds. As Trio gained momentum, tensions occasionally brewed, not from jealousy, but from the weight of expectations. Producers wanted Linda to sing differently. Some even hinted she should match Dolly's sparkle. Linda didn't confront. It wasn't her style. But in one meeting, after yet another suggestion to be more radio-friendly, she calmly said, "If I change the way I sing to fit the picture, then it's not my voice anymore." No one argued after that. What kept their friendship alive wasn't perfection. It was honesty. And when the second Trio album finally arrived, its quieter reception didn't shake their bond. For Linda, it wasn't betrayal. It was absence. And absence, she would later say, is harder to heal than anger. She never blamed Dolly for needing space. She didn't fault her for walking away from a few tracks. But what haunted her was the missed chance. the one conversation they never had. In 2005, in a private heart-to-heart with Emmylou, Linda finally let her guard down. She said, "I wasn't angry at Dolly for leaving. I was hurt that she assumed I pushed her out without ever asking me." That line didn't come from resentment. It came from heartbreak. Their magic had always been effortless. Linda, Dolly, and Emmylou once stepped on stage without rehearsals, letting instinct and trust guide every harmony. They didn't need direction. They were the direction. But after Trio 2, that rhythm broke. No reunion tours, no shared spotlights, just the sound of time moving forward without them ever returning to where it all began. Years later, they stood side by side again, smiling politely at a Washington Awards ceremony, flashing grins for the cameras. On the surface, nothing seemed wrong. But Linda could feel it. That warmth, that old, unspeakable bond, it was no longer there. Not out of malice, just distance. A distance built not from arguments, but from all the words they never said. Dolly, in Linda's eyes, was never the villain. She admired her deeply, called her brilliant, called her one of the most intuitive producers she'd ever worked with. But that didn't erase the quiet void that followed their misunderstanding. And Linda, always the quiet storm, never made it a headline. She didn't go to the press. She didn't fan the flames. But when she finally spoke, it wasn't to accuse. It was to explain the sorrow that lingers when two artists drift apart without closure. For Linda, not every friendship needed to end perfectly. But if there was one she wished had survived the chaos of fame, it was this one. She once scribbled in a private note, "Some people aren't meant to stay, but some are worth the effort. And sometimes we just run out of time to try." That kind of wisdom doesn't come from bitterness. It comes from a lifetime of learning how fragile real connection can be, especially for women in the industry, where strength is expected, but vulnerability is seen as weakness. Linda never clung to image. She clung to truth, even when that truth meant acknowledging that something beautiful had quietly slipped away. And yet, she never stopped celebrating what they created. She never downplayed the brilliance of Dolly or the steadiness of Emmylou. What they shared was rare. 3 women, 3 visions, 1 harmony. But sometimes even harmony can't survive the weight of unspoken emotions. And now that Linda has finally shared her truth, not to attack, but to explain, maybe it's time we listen. Not just to the music, but to the spaces between the notes. Because that's where the real stories live.